When the books of the Bible were originally written, there were no such things as chapters or verses. Each book was written without any breaks from the beginning to the end. The chapter and verse divisions were added to the Bible for the sake of convenience. There is no authoritative basis for the divisions we now find. A man named Stephen Langton divided the Bible into chapters in the year AD 1227. Langton was a professor at the University of Paris, and later he became the Archbishop of Canterbury. Robert Stephanus Stephens, a French printer, divided the verses for his Greek New Testament. It was published in 1551. The first entire Bible in which these chapter and verse divisions were used was Stephens' edition of the Latin Vulgate in 1555. The first English New Testament to have both chapter and verse divisions was the Geneva Bible in 1560. Fortunately, Jewish scholars have followed the way of dividing the Hebrew Scripture into chapters and verses. The chapter and verse divisions are convenient for reference and quotation purposes. They make it easier to find certain statements and accounts in Scripture. Yet the chapter and verse divisions can cause a number of problems. It must always be remembered that the divisions into chapters and verses are human-made. They are sometimes arbitrary, and they sometimes interfere with the sense of the passage. The first step in Bible interpretation is to ignore the modern chapter and verse divisions. The divisions into chapters and verses can actually cause some problems. There are instances where chapters are wrongly divided. For example, the end of Matthew chapter 16 should actually be placed with the beginning of Matthew 17. Jesus said,
"Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom."
The next verse reads,
After 6 days Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves.
This verse should have been in the same chapter as the previous verse, since it is continuing the story. Dividing the Bible into verses can also give the opinion that the Scripture consists of a number or maxims or wise sayings. For example, Paul wrote to the Colossians,
"Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch."
This verse gives the impression that Scripture encourages some type of physical self-denial. Yet just the opposite is true. In context, Paul is actually teaching against this type of behavior. This verse previous to this reads as follows.
These rules, which have to do with things that are all destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teachings.
Therefore, this one verse, read on its own, gives the wrong impression of the biblical teaching. This is one of the problems with the Bible divided into verses, in that people will isolate the verses from the rest of the context. The original authors of Scripture did not intend that their writings be divided up into chapters or verses. They intended that the books be read straight through from the beginning. A number of the books of Scripture can be read through in one sitting. This is the best way to discover what the author is trying to say. Dividing up the Scripture into chapters and verses encourages people to read only small parts at a time. This is not always helpful. In the original text of the various books of the Bible there are no such things as chapter and verse divisions. They were added later for the sake of convenience. While they are helpful, they are not authoritative in any sense of the term. In fact, they can cause a number of problems. Chapter and verse divisions give the impression that the Scripture should be read and studied in bits and pieces. This is not what the original authors intended. The entire context must always be considered. Consequently, the chapter and verse divisions should be ignored when one attempts to properly interpret the entire message of Scripture.